Welcome to the webinar. This is the third and final webinar in this online dialogue convened by the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. This SCC online dialogue focuses on the key components of the 2030 Development Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk. This professional development offering is based on the premise that teaching faculty need to understand these fundamentals of the governing framework for sustainable development for the next 15 years. Our online dialogue process includes the 3 webinars plus access to relevant resources, a facilitated Q&A on our Collaborate platform, and the co-creation of a synthesis document by all registrants. This online dialogue included 2 prior webinars back on July 26th. The first webinar covered the concept of planetary boundaries in the Anthropocene as the basis for understanding the new Sustainable Development Goals. We had Kevin Noon from Stockholm University, Faye Leone from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and Ashwani Vashisht from Ramapo College. The second webinar on August 9th covered the elements of the Paris Climate Agreement. Our presenters in that webinar included Mark Trexler from the Climatographers, Will Burns from the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment, and Don Brown of Widener Law School. Today, in the final webinar of this series, Deborah Johnson and Aris Papadopoulos will introduce us to the basics of the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, and they will emphasize the linkages between all 3 components of the 2030 Development Agenda, which, taken together, can serve as a comprehensive game plan for sustainable development. All the videos of these webinars are posted on the SCC YouTube channel, and we invite all of you to join us on the Collaborate platform to participate in the follow-on Q&A and the co-creation of the synthesis document. If you cannot locate your Collaborate invitation, an email was sent to you at the time of your registration. If you can't find it, please just contact us to request a new invitation. With that introduction, I want to hand it over to Jess Guerrier, who will introduce our expert presenters for today. Jess?
Thanks, Ira, and thanks for all of you for attending this webinar. Whether you are introducing yourself or your colleagues to these topics for the first time, or whether you consider yourself to be experts in this area, we know that your time is valuable, and there are many creative and productive ways that you could have used your time. So we want to thank you for being here and hope that this webinar and the activities that will follow from it will be valuable to you. So it's my honor to introduce to you our expert presenters today. Deborah A.K. Johnson is a strategic resilience and sustainability advisor with a background in corporate sustainability consulting, product development, and global business and market strategy. Deborah has spent portions of her career moving between business owner and corporate entrepreneur, enabling her to work with a number of sectors, including insurance, banking, healthcare, apparel, oil and gas, building products, and chemicals, to name a few. From 1998 to 2014, she held managerial positions with DuPont, where she was sought out for her thought leadership and ability to identify and frame emerging needs across a wide variety of industries. In October of 2014, she formed Deborah A.K. Johnson, LLC, in order to establish a collaborative business model that brings together deep experts who can provide scientific, social, political, educational, environmental, economic, and technological guidance on the topics of disaster risk reduction and resilience, climate adaptation, and sustainable development. In her more recent roles, Deborah worked at both the business and enterprise levels and developed integrated frameworks and approaches to translate corporate sustainability aspirations into increased revenues, new products, and expanded services. This included leading life cycle assessments to uncover product footprint impacts and converting the findings to claims that increased market share and revenues. She helped to define and introduce sustainability elements at the fuzzy front end of product development and paved the way for DuPont's consulting division's first climate-related vulnerability studies, while encouraging DuPont businesses as well as its customers to consider the role of resilience across their operations and capital flows. Deborah has served on nonprofit sustainability certification and advisory boards, and is a member of the UN International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNISDR, where she's led working groups, presented to the UN General Assembly Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, and the Americas Regional Platform, and recently co-authored a chapter on the private sector and resilience for a Springer publication, Disaster Management and Private Sector, Challenges and Potentials, released March 2015 at the World Congress for Disaster Risk Reduction. So we're thrilled to have Deborah with us today. Our second presenter is Aris Papadopoulos, who is the founder and chair of Resilience Action Fund and Resilience Action Fund International. He authored the book Resilience, The Ultimate Sustainability, Lessons from Failing to Develop a Stronger and Safer Built Environment. He is a World Trade Center 9/11 survivor. Aris holds the position of Distinguished Expert in Resilience at Florida International University's Extreme Events Institute, the FIU EEI. Aris serves on the board of the United Nations Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies, or UN ARISE, and was the founding chair in 2011 of the UN International Strategy on Disaster Reduction, the UNISDR, Private Sector Advisory Group. He represented the private sector at the 3rd UN Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction and played an active role in developing the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 through 2030. He advocated the cause of resilience and disaster risk reduction in the built environment before 2 UN Global Platform Conferences and at Rio+20. Aris has 35 years of experience in the construction, materials, and energy industries. He chairs the board of ST Equipment and Technology, a worldwide provider of industrial waste reclamation and water conservation equipment and technology solutions. In 2014, he retired from Titan America, a U.S. building materials company, after serving as CEO for 20 years. He was founding chair of the Concrete Joint Sustainability Initiative in 2009 and past chair of the Portland Cement Association. In 2013, he received the American Concrete Institute's Sustainability Award. He served on the board of CTL Group, a construction research and consultancy firm, the editorial board of the U.S. Green Concrete Council, and the advisory board of the MIT Concrete Sustainability Hub. Aris earned bachelor's and master's degrees from MIT in chemical engineering and an MBA from Harvard University. He lives in Miami, Florida, and is a steward at the St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Church. So thank you, Aris, for being with us today. We're thrilled to have you as well. And with that, I will turn things over to Deborah.
All right. Hopefully you're seeing my screen.
We are.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jess, thanks so much for those very complete introductions. Very much appreciated. And Ira and Jess for this opportunity. Aris and I are really very pleased to be able to share the Sendai framework with you, and we look forward to the continued dialogue over the next few weeks. I'm basically happy to lead out, so just giving you a little idea about the content for the next few minutes. I'll lead out providing a broad overview of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction And this will be followed by Eris, who will discuss resilience and illustrate some of the major issues and challenges in our built environment, specifically as they relate, of course, to disaster risk. I'll return in the last few minutes to tie the Sendai, SDGs, and Paris Agreement together a bit, and I'll show where there are intersections and opportunities to cooperate to drive some mutual success. A little bit of fair warning, and this is just to let you know a few of the slides toward the end are a bit dense, but this is really to ensure that they are as clear as possible and able to stand alone, especially as we engage in our dialogue sessions. So let's go ahead and jump in. The Sendai Framework 2015-30 was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference in Sendai, Japan. It is the outcome of stakeholder consultations that were initiated in March 2012 and intergovernmental negotiations that took place from July 2014 to March 2015. It was obviously supported by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and this was at the request of the UN General Assembly. It is a voluntary and non-binding agreement. The framework seeks to achieve the substantial reduction of disaster risks and losses for everyone, everywhere. The driving force behind it has been the UN ISDR, also referred to as the Office of Disaster Risk, and it is made up of 3 groups: science and technology, nation states, and the private sector. As you heard in the introduction, Eris and I are members of ARISE, which is actually the private sector alliance for resilient communities beneath or within the UN ISDR. Whoops, hang on just a second. Sorry, I just got a little lag there in my... There we go. All right. Are you still with me? Just want to check.
Yes, we're still connected.
All right, great. Thank you. Before drilling down further into the Sendai framework, I thought we might just take a look and again, providing some good general grounding for the general history and genesis of the UN ISDR and the Sendai framework. You'll see the 1960s experienced a number of devastating global disasters, and mostly in the form of earthquakes in Iran and the then country of Yugoslavia, and hurricanes in Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. In that year, together, these events took nearly 50,000 lives and led to significant material destruction. In response, the 1970s saw a series of deepening and broadening UN resolutions, beginning with the creation of the UN Disaster Relief Office in 1971. Throughout the 80s, the focus was on defining and strengthening the UN systems to respond to natural and other disasters. The 90s brought forth the first work on an international framework that in turn led to the 1994 World Conference on Disaster Reduction in Yokohama, Japan. In 2000, an interagency secretariat for disaster risk reduction was established, making way for the UN ISDR. The Johannesburg Plan of Action in 2002 provided the first set of concrete objectives within the Sustainable Development Agenda. So this is the first intersection that we see between the SDGs and disaster risk. The Hyogo Framework for Action 2005-15 served as a strong predecessor for today's Sendai Framework, with its emphasis on building the resilience of nations and communities. There are differences certainly between the Hyogo and the Sendai framework. Most significant is that the focus has moved from managing disasters to managing risk. This requires a more holistic approach to risks and a stronger focus on risk creation processes, and it presents opportunities to approach disaster risk reduction as an integral part of sustainable development. The Sendai framework is also more inclusive of the private sector. It places high expectations on public-private partnerships, education, capacity building, and collaboration at all levels. The framework aims to drive the substantial reduction, as I mentioned earlier, of disaster losses and a large portion of the actions are focused on preventing new and reducing existing potential for disasters. In the center of this graphic are the focal areas. As is the case with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, these are far-reaching and they are also very comprehensive. From our previous dialogue webinars, we can begin to see that there are common elements that underpin as well as interconnect these frameworks. Each framework on its own and together relies on macro and micro operational changes at nearly every social, economic, and political level. At the highest levels, each is striving for inclusion, collaboration, and the ability to effectively and efficiently deal with complexity. Progress and success depends on contributions from every discipline. Again, just as we've heard from others on these webinars, no single individual or set of skills, profession, or sector is really capable or responsible for the needed solutions. It is instead the collective contributions that tentacle together to inform, improve, create, and deliver resilience and sustainability at the 2.0, 3.0 levels and beyond. These 4 priorities are the framework's touchstones. They guide actions and behaviors. The UNISDR and ARISE are measuring their progress against these priorities. They focus on building understanding, strengthening governance, investing in resilience, and the built environment. Although Priority 4 addresses building back better, it's important to note here that the Sendai Agreement promotes building better from the start as well. And I really must credit ARIS for this inclusion. It was not as easy as you might think to have countries or the major groups allow this statement to be included. Beneath the priorities lie 7 time-bound global targets. They're assembled here into columns that contain impacts that will be reduced and actions that will be increased. People affected, losses in lives in the economy, and damage and disruption to infrastructure and basic services are all to be substantially reduced by 2030. You'll note that the metrics for impacts to people are averaged, affected, or lost per 100,000 over comparative periods of time. This is basically a starting point. Targets on the right are aimed at better managing risk through increases in disaster risk uptake at the country level and increases in and access to multi-hazard early warning systems, information, and assessments. Diving down a bit more, several of ARISE's 140 members are working on 7 themes that encourage cooperation, collaboration, and integration of disaster risk management strategies across all regions and sectors. I'll draw your attention here to the work stream on education and training. This group is working with leading universities, training institutions, professional associations, and educational outreach programs in all regions to introduce or improve the inclusion of disaster risk management into the curricula of education and training services. This is one of my primary areas of focus as an ARISE member. Moving to the implementation layer, these are Theme 4's targets. There is good progress across these 7 targets, most specifically in the development of disaster risk reduction course materials at the MBA level, which is being driven by Florida International University, and that's 4.2. And short course materials for small and mid-sized businesses led by Enel. Both of these are ARISE members. Some links and documents have been added to our Collaborate platform that I believe will be useful as we continue this dialogue. In the run-up to 2015 and to support implementation of the SDG goals, the UNISDR developed a set of new 10 essentials. They did this in collaboration with a group of over 100 distinguished city and expert members. The main objective of these is to move forward from its predecessor that focused on building advocacy to now becoming operational, We'll touch on this more later, but if you were to think about where the most powerful cooperative partnering opportunities to lower all our risks, protect our environment, and build better, you would likely point to our cities. For this reason, one of the strongest tools developed by RISE members, IBM and AECOM, is a city resilience tool. Sorry about some of the issues with advancing my slides here. So figure 1 broadly maps the 10 essentials to illustrate the relatively complete coverage of the many issues cities need to address to become more disaster resilient. When these 10 elements are layered beside the SDGs and the climate agreement, the results are the identification of multi-hazards as well as enabler and co-benefit rich solutions. Essentials 1 through 3 address governance and financial issues. 4 to 8 address dimensions of planning, prevention, and disaster preparation. And Essentials 9 and 10 address disaster response itself, post-event recovery, and cycle around to build back with better levels of risk reduction and resilience. As you've seen, the Sendai framework hasn't walked away from disaster preparation or response, but it has thrown a lot of weight behind reducing and even eliminating the conditions that have put so many people and so much capital at risk. There we go. Sorry about that. The World Bank graphic, this World Bank graphic, conveys the change from reactive to proactive risk management while suggesting the relationships between sustainable development, climate change, and disaster risk. The interdependencies here are fairly evident. The Sendai framework addresses risk in the outer ring of this diagram. Managing risks inside development, connecting the dependent variables through cross-cutting measures that align all 3 frameworks to achieve the integration of disaster risk management at the social, government, and business levels. This is an ideal place for me to turn the presentation over to Aris, who will talk about many of the challenges that we face in making this shift. I will be back at the close of the webinar with more thoughts on the Sendai framework and its relationships to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Before turning it over, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them. Thank you. Back to you, Ira.
Thanks, Deborah. I've shifted the presenter controls over to Aris so he can put up his screen. But before we start with Aris, let me check with Jess. Are there any questions to this point?
Sure, and thank you, Deborah, for really clearly outlining what's a really complex set of issues and processes for this work. You briefly mentioned the work stream on education and training as part of the overall picture of this work. And one of the things I was curious about is whether educators in higher ed have access to what's discussed at this level, what the feedback loops might be, or in other words, what channels or tools does ARISE use to sense what's most urgent for education and ESD practitioners. And I guess a follow-on to that would be how educators could learn more or engage in this work stream.
All right, I'll start with sort of a short answer to that, and then I do want to hand it over to Aris, who also has been very much on the front line of this discussion, and I think can add some dimension to the question that you're asking. So there's access basically is really through membership. And that is really first and foremost. And so anyone who is looking to become a member of this group is certainly going to have complete access and also can serve on that particular theme. And I do know that there is quite a bit of outreach going on to the universities across the nation. and even globally. And I'm going to pass it over to Aris so he can talk about that a little bit, and also perhaps address your questions about the prioritization process. So Aris, do you mind if I pass it to you?
Sure, Deborah. Without spending too much time, I think you properly said the core membership is the private sector, meaning essentially businesses or entities that are controlled by businesses. But the structure allows for engagement of other non-business entities through associate membership, and really the themes and the project and so forth engage all members. So you don't have to necessarily be a business member to be engaged in a project. It is a moving kind of and learning organization in a big sense, in that the priorities and shifts are determined by the members themselves that are engaged. And obviously the board of the group and the UNISDR acts as a sounding board. And also what is in preparation, let's say, is the infrastructure to help fund some projects that go beyond just the voluntary engagement that members have. So that's kind of a summary, I'd say, of a much bigger subject. And of course, on the website, the public website, there's more information available.
Very good. And with that, we should launch into Aris's presentation. And I note that we can get more granular on the various tools and opportunities for educators in the follow-up Q&A on Collaborase. Aris, all yours.
Sure. Before I get into the topics, let me just thank again the Sustainable Curriculum Consortium for this opportunity. As you can ascertain from my background, I am neither an academic or a scientist, although I am an engineer by training. I've been in the business world and as an executive, as a business world all my career, and an executive most of my career. And therefore, I consider myself a practitioner in the fields of sustainability and resilience. I hope I can bring a useful and practical perspective to this discussion and the sustainability curriculum, because I understand that many of you in universities will be teaching the future scientists and academics, but hopefully you will also be teaching many more practitioners in resilient sustainability. And therefore, my focus has been not just on the mechanics of how a lot of these UN organizations and initiatives are structured, but how we can bring actionable strategies and implementation to the table. My presentation is organized around 5 topics, and I'll touch on the topic of resilience, initially how it relates to climate and sustainability and green, in a very simple 1-slide model. Then I'll go back to that in the 5th topic. But I'd like to put that up front so you have it in the back of your mind as I'm discussing more details in the rest of the presentation. Then I'll go on to talk about the main topic of my presentation, which is really a case study on resilience in the built environment, and spend quite a bit of time digging into all the dimensions of that, and especially the root causes. And finally, in the topics 3 through 5, I want to bring up how resilience essentially connects to the issues of in society, to the issues in the insurance field, and finally to the environment, where I'll turn back to the model that I put up right after this. So let's begin with this general discussion on where resilience fits in. Sendai is clearly focused on resilience, but what is resilience? And it depends a lot on who you talk to and what they're advancing. And how does it relate to green, to climate, and to sustainability? What I'd like to present is a simple 2-dimensional model that will be helpful for the rest of the presentation. Not that it's the only model, obviously there are many more dimensions than 2, but I think it gives a perspective on how, at least from the built environment, one can look at things. Resilience is defined in various ways. A lot of people like to define it as the ability to rebound from a shock or a hazard. But for this purpose, I like to really focus on resilience, the resilience dimension of long functional life. In other words, the things that we do that have a long functional life and can perform not just over decades, but perhaps over centuries, if they're properly built and maintained. The second element here that we bring is the green element, which for the purposes here relates to anything that drives energy efficiency and creates a low environmental footprint. Now, I always like to stress that these are two distinct areas, and there's sometimes this confusion when we talk to people who have been working on the green side for many years, because all of a sudden they just label what they're doing as resilient and think that's fine. I have a problem with that because I think that resilient is a distinct, based on the definition I gave you, attribute. And really what's sustainable is that overlap area where you have something that's both resilient and green at the same time. Now, where does climate fit into all this? There are two dimensions of climate. There's the mitigation side, and that's clearly a green activity and relates to things we can do to address the drivers of atmospheric temperature rise. And some of those activities are resilient, but some may not be. And then there's the adaptation side, which are things and actions we must take to address the consequences of atmospheric temperature rise, which clearly is in the resilience side of the graph, but can have a green overlap too. So this is a simple model that I'd like you to keep in the back of your minds as I talk about in more detail the built environment. So moving on to the main topic. We'll cover here really some discussion of what really is resilience in the built environment. Why is the built environment being stressed so much in at least this presentation, and even in Sendai, and issues related to losses, the magnitude of these, the drivers of these, but especially the root causes, some of which are in the economic system that we've created that drives the actions and decisions that we make. Resilience has various objects, and most of these are addressed in Sendai. There's the health and safety dimension of resilience. There's the food and agriculture. There's energy resilience. There's socioeconomic resilience. But this presentation will really focus on just one of these. But I do need to say that all these, in the end, do interlink, do affect each other. So even though we're isolating the built environment has an effect on all others, and vice versa. Second, there are many different varieties of hazards. And we will be focusing here on natural hazards, which means all the hazards that most of us are familiar with, from hurricanes to tornadoes to earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, fires, landslides, etc. But there's a category called biological hazards, and a recent Zika is one of those, Ebola, SARS, the mad cow disease, avian flu, and to go back in prior centuries, cholera and Black Death, those were all biological hazards. Then we have astronomical hazards, meteors, gamma ray bursts, or major solar storms that can affect the resilience of our environment. And finally, what I call anthropogenic hazards, where you basically need to include wars, terrors, cyber, pollution, and even the financial bubbles that humans create. But our focus here will be on the natural hazards. Now, drilling in a little bit further, there are 4 natural hazards that really account, based on insurance records, for 85% and more of the economic losses. And those are wind, water, fire, and seismic. So if we just focus on those, we will capture most of the drivers for the economic losses that we're seeing. So why the built environment? let's put into context. The built environment is a subset of a bigger natural environment. Within that, we have the socioeconomic environment that humans have created. And in this, we have the built environment, which represents our homes, our buildings, roads, and infrastructure that are really meant to last, hopefully 50 years, but ideally a century and maybe even 2-3 centuries, recognizing they may need to be renovated periodically. Along the side of that is the consumption environment, which includes consumables and short-term assets, which have lifespans typically not more than 10 or 15 years. And I include in that category our cars, our electronics, our appliances, our furnishings, but also our foods, our energy, our clothing, etc. So this is where the built environment sits in the overall kind of nesting of environments. Now, why do we put such emphasis on the built environment? Well, research shows that we spend more than 90% of our lives in buildings. And the balance is spent either in transportation or outdoors. But even in those latter, we're never far from the built environment itself. In fact, the built environment is what protects us. I call it the cocoon, protecting us and our activities from the natural elements, and is the first line of defense in protecting lives and assets. It's also the largest asset class in terms of the value of investment that we've made. It also is expected to be one of the largest future investment, especially in the developing economies going forward. And finally, it is showing that it is increasingly failing to hazards, which drives us to look further. What do we mean with resilience? For communities, it means basically remaining habitable and functional after a shock or a hazard. Companies like to put this in different language. A few companies like to talk to their boards or to their shareholders in communications about disasters and risks, so they phrase it in terms of business continuity, but it really means the same thing. So following the introduction, what is the problem we face? In one graph, it's this, that over the last half century, the global economic losses have been escalating. And based on US UN estimates, they are averaging over $300 billion annually. This figure exceeds the GDP of 80% of the world's countries. Even the UN admits that this number is probably not capturing all the losses, just the major ones. So the actual losses in total could be approaching $500 billion on average a year. This kind of a figure has a staggering impact on economic and social development. And many, of course, what is driving this? Many like today to attribute these losses to climate, but the answer is a bit more complex. And looking at the drivers here, starting in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution drove a greater urbanization. That brought about a concentration of assets in a smaller footprint, concentrated risk, and driving the expected losses. This urbanization continues today, continued in the 20th century, and continues today to the point where by 2050, it's expected that 2/3 of humanity will be urbanized. So a huge concentration of global assets in smaller and smaller footprints. The second driver is something I call coastalization, which means an increased development of vulnerable lands, including coastal lands, but other vulnerable lands for development, because essentially in the process of urbanizing, we ran out of the good land. We ran out of the high ground, we ran out of the non-flood prone land, and we essentially filled between whatever we could and built on that. And that has also increased our exposure to risks. Just on those two drivers, urbanization and coastalization, we are failing today, and we are in trouble. And on top of that, today we have the emergence of climate, where I believe we have not really experienced the consequences of that. So climate will just make our resilience and our ability to withstand hazards even worse going forward. Now, on top of this, we have the problem that in the 20th century, we have essentially cheapened our construction. And this graph essentially displays along two axes. One is hazard resilience. The higher up you are, the more resilient you are to hazards, and the percent of built environment. It displays the dichotomy we have in our built environment. On the blue side, on the high end, we have what I call our more resilient facilities, which are public facilities, our institutional and large commercial, and even many of the high residential that are built to higher standards, let's say. And on the red end there, we have our low-rise residential and our smaller commercial that are built to lower standards. And in fact, we have been driving down the standards in a lot of the smaller end there over the previous decades. For example, the famous 2x4 for home construction ceased being a 2x4 30 some years ago, and in fact is only a 1.5 by 3.5 dimensioned piece of material. In fact, the old 2x4 had almost 40% more material than the current one has. And this is just an example. We have cheapened and reduced our construction in many areas. So on top of the increased hazards, on top of the increased vulnerability from urbanization and coastalization, and today climate, we are facing it with a much weaker built environment that we have built in the last half century, particularly. I like to call the residential and small commercial the weak underbelly of our built environment. Now, to a lot of business people that I sometimes talk to who are in the upper end, I say, well, you may think you don't have to worry because your facilities are more resilient, but think that many of your suppliers, your distributors, your customers, and your employees are in that weaker lower end. So you are vulnerable, and you have to care about what happens in the whole built environment. So that kind of opens up their eyes at that point. Now, in talking to the business community, oftentimes I like to say that independent of where you stand on the science and trying to bring more consensus, as business people, let's just see where the money is going, where the money is being lost. So at least we can agree on one thing, that there is money being lost, and let's try to understand what we can do about it. Well, 90% of the economic losses, and we saw the magnitude globally of where that is in one of the earlier charts, is in the built environment. In fact, 80% of those losses are in the privately owned built environment. So the private sector, meaning homeowners, businesses, etc., are really bearing the brunt of losses because they are the weaker component. And when you look at what percent of the private assets are being lost, 70% of those private assets, in fact, are residential. So again, demonstrating that is the weak underbelly, and even though we don't get good cost breakdown from our disasters, from our own U.S. agencies, and you have to dig deep into the information to find out what's going, most of what's being lost in disasters like Katrina, Sandy, etc., are residential assets. Now, if you thought this is just a developing world issue, it's not. In fact, 70% of the global losses are in the developed economies. The issues vary between developing economies and developed economies, whereas in the developing economies, the issues are the lack of codes, the lack of zoning, and very weak or non-existent enforcement. In the developed economies, we do have codes, we do have standards, and we do have enforcement. But the problem we have in the developed world is that these standards are too low, and they have not grown proportionally to the evolution of risks over the last century. So we've kept the standards low, and if, in fact, when you look at the developed world, half of these losses are in one country, the US. And that's why in my book I focused on using the U.S. as a case study to try to help the rest of the world not repeat the same mistakes that we have made in the U.S. So we are the #1 leader in economic losses globally. Now, another interesting observation is that we have invested quite a bit in disasters, but they are mostly on the emergency side. We've invested in alert systems, in evacuation systems, in response and rescue capacity. But what you'll find is that these two are inversely related. In other words, the less you invest in resilience, the more you need to invest in emergency capacity. And we today are somewhere up here when we need to be somewhere down there. And we're chasing our tail essentially because by avoiding investing in resilience, we're having to put more money into the emergency services and emergency capacity that we're funding, including the firefighting system that we have in the U.S., which is the largest in the world. And the number of firefighters, both salaried and volunteer, are as large as the U.S. Army. So that's the cost premium we pay today to be low resilience. Now, looking at the Sendai framework is an important milestone in this journey from a reactive approach to hazards to a more proactive approach. And it's been an evolution from civil defense, emergency response, and emergency management to managing risks, addressing mitigation, and building resilience capacity. However, this change has been quite slow. And a lot has to do with the people who are still involved in the matter. In fact, when you go to these UN conferences, you still see most of the people attending are from emergency response agencies. And what we need to move toward resilience is more participation from economic development and finance people who are actually behind the investments that are being destroyed. So this is not this is still an issue and still a challenge for the both national and international communities. Just as an illustration, I put this summary up of how the U.S. historically has evolved and its institutions have evolved in this topic. Again, underlying the evolution from defense and emergency response to what we have today, that to me, FEMA today still is pretty much a firefighting organization, and there are still questions as to whether resilience can be adequately addressed by FEMA or whether some other body needs to play an integrating role. And still in this country, it's very fragmented. There are a lot of groups, NIST, NIBS, and so on. The abbreviations go on that have small pieces of the puzzle, but there's not one integrating institution that is bringing resilience forward. Because I like to talk about the root causes, I'm going to discuss in the next 5 slides a little bit how we got to today's problems and how we built this house of cards. And there are 5 elements to this, and there'll be one per each slide. One is the whole system of codes that we have, the role of government, the role of our notion of affordability and what it drives us to do, the speculative building sector that we have, and finally, the consumer themselves. So let's start with codes, so the number 1. Why have codes failed us? Well, few people know that our code system was never meant to protect assets. The codes have been developed under the mindset of giving people enough time to get out. So we have created a system of escape codes, and that's where the codes stop. What we really need, if we want to protect our homes, our communities, and so forth, is a different system, a system of resilience codes. But few people know that when you buy a home and they tell you it's built to code and has an occupancy permit, that really all that means that it was built to give you enough time to escape. If it catches fire or an earthquake happens or some other storm, windstorm, or whatever a serious event happens, it's not meant to survive. So it's a major, and unfortunately governments are not willing to admit that openly. I mean, you'll find it in some fine print in FEMA's reports and documents, but it needs to be admitted. The second is that governments, through their actions, have created a lot of moral hazard in the system. And there are many examples of that. I kind of focus on the National Flood Insurance Program that started in the 60s and was well-intentioned. It was intentioned essentially because the private investors figured that they could never make money in flood insurance because the development was so vulnerable. So the government stepped in and said, we can do it, and we'll get the communities to become better in terms of controlling floods and building more resilient. Well, they failed in the latter, and they essentially subsidized risk-taking for half a century to the point where the National Flood Insurance Program is $23 billion in debt today. So if it were a private company, it would be long bankrupt. However, on the backs of taxpayers, it's continuing to do what it's doing, trying to update its flood maps, trying to create incentives, but because it is a politically controlled organization, it can only do so much before it runs against the obstacles of affordability and interests that oppose higher costs and oppose the development in riskier locations. Also, we observed in the last 20, 30 years an escalation of disaster declarations. The driver for that is when you get a disaster declared, it opens the gates for federal monies, and so the money comes out, and people are now expecting that when they're in a disaster that their government will declare it, and then the money will open and they'll be fine. So that drives a moral hazard, that lack of local, let's say, and personal accountability for resilience. So in other words, a lot of the government policies we have today are driving us in the wrong direction. The third dimension here, the third factor, is our notion of affordability. And whenever you get into debates and discussions on codes and standards, you run against the obstacle that says, well, these are all nice, but we can't afford them. And ironically, we use the lowest standards to create the most expensive solution for society when you add the cost of disasters and rebuilding and recovery. In no other part of our lives do we default so easily to the lowest standard. We don't go to the lowest standard in health, not in education, not in transport, food, clothing, etc. But in the most important purchase and decision in our lives, which is our homes, the system defaults us to the minimal standard, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the escape codes. So that's what we get. And affordability is used as a rationale for that. And what I like to point out is that instead of lowering standards to make things affordable, we need to find out how we can make resilience, how we can make this higher standards affordable to everybody that needs that. And we'll touch on this issue when we get to the social dimensions a little bit later. The fourth dimension here is the reality that 75%, 3/4 or more of our residential and light commercial construction in the U.S. is speculative. In other words, the parties building this segment of the built environment do not intend to own it for more than 1 to 3 years. So what we have is one party creating the risk, and then another party, the eventual owners, paying for it. And the first group, the party that creates the risk, is opposed to raising the standards. So that essentially has led us to where we are on that curve that I showed earlier with the weak underbelly of the built environment. And finally, we have consumers that are kept in the dark. We have over 7 million residential transactions a year in the U.S. I doubt that more than 0.001% of those know the hazards of the home they're buying. Most don't even know the elevation of the home they have, either from sea level or from the nearest river, active river or stream there. FEMA themselves will not disclose the history, the flood history of a piece of property. They consider that confidential information. So the consumer's in the dark. MLSs don't say much. The real estate industry doesn't really want that to be become a forefront in information because they feel it slows down their ability to sell. And what we're distracted by is cosmetic features in our purchase. The countertops, the closets, things like that, rather than really what's behind the wall, where we put at risk all our, not just our lives, but all our possessions that we have inside homes. So if you want to make a comparison, and I have done that, the building industry today is where the car industry was half a century ago. And for those of you that are old enough, you may have heard of the Corvair, a very pretty car that was produced in the 60s with great chrome and other cosmetic features, but a very unsafe car. And until Ralph Nader put the spotlight on not just this car, but the whole industry, you know, everyone thought that this is the best we could have. In fact, the car industry at that time argued that additional safety features could not be afforded. They were not affordable. Nobody would buy them, and a lot were not even technically possible. And yet today, we enjoy the safety of many features that even if we were to given the opportunity to opt out of them and save some money by not having the collapsible steering wheel or the bags or the reinforced bumpers and doors, we wouldn't do it because we know better. In fact, we know better because for decades, and those who watch TV in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the message was brought in many ways to our living rooms. And we could see the cars colliding on walls, the dummies in the cars, and so forth. And the collaboration between insurers, public interest groups, government, and the media assured that this message was brought through. Well, today we have something similar happening for homes. And the insurance industry has pulled together a coalition 5 years ago or so called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And they have built a crash test facility just south of Charlotte, North Carolina, to crash test actual homes. And if you go to their website, you can actually see a home built to code in a particular area. I think this one was somewhere in the Midwest, and a home built to a higher above code standard, which they have called fortified, and how easily, as you ramp up the wind, that home built to code just is blown off its base. So those are the homes that are built today, the ones that are blown off their base. And the insurance industry is communicating this initially to code officials and to the building industry. But I really hope that they take these images and these messages to homes like they did for automobiles, using obviously the modern media we have today. Now, the building industry looks at resilience and opposes resilience because they only see it as a cost. And they don't see the value of making more money from making something, building something to a higher standard. And the reason for that is because the consumer doesn't see the value today of a higher standard. And the reason the consumer doesn't see the higher value is because of the low level of awareness, transparency, and education we have today among consumers on resilience. So today's consumer differentiates very little between a higher resilient, let's say, home and a lower resilience home. This is all going to change in the coming decades. And in fact, the high resilience homes will appreciate more in value, whereas the low resilience homes will lose value in the future. And there's a lot of things going on that will start emerging in the coming years. Some have already started coming out, but will become more publicly known, that will drive this awareness, this transparency, and this education forward. Now, a lot of people say, where's the money going to come from to invest in resilience? My reaction to that is that the money is already there. It's just being spent today on cosmetics. In fact, I was really surprised when I saw this a few months ago from the American Architect Association, that they reported that for 2016, the U.S. public will spend almost $350 billion into home remodelings, additions, and improvements. Unfortunately, a lot of that is going into cosmetics. If the public was more educated and more aware, a lot of it should be spent today on improving the resilience to hazards. So that concludes the second topic, which was the largest part of the presentation. Ira, do you want to raise any questions, open up to questions at this point, or should I continue to the other topics? Back to you.
Well, you've already covered quite a bit, and I think I would like to ask a couple of quick questions at this point, and perhaps Jess has seen other questions come in from our listeners. Looking at this from a policy perspective, you talked about the role of FEMA. You mentioned a couple of other acronyms like NIST and NIBS, which I'm sure many listening in would like to know what exactly those entities are and the role they play. But what I really would like to hear is your best guess or strongest suggestion for how we in the U.S. need to take on board the Sendai orientation in the way, as you've explained, it has evolved from earlier iterations of Hyogo. Where do you see resilience policy going in this country?
Well, that's a big question, and I appreciate you bringing it up because it's an important question. I think, we have a system in the U.S. that's quite fragmented when it comes to policy in regard to the built environment. We have delegated essentially not just the states, but to the local communities the opportunity to create their own building policies. We're starting to realize the limitations of that and the social and economic implications of that. So I believe that even though there is opposition to a lot of this coming from the building community, let's say, coming from local interests, that we will see more national direction on the subject of resilience, which means some minimal standards at a national level that at least initially everybody benefiting from federal resources, let's say, whether they are in terms of funding or loan guarantees or insurance, services and so forth, will have to adhere to. And I think we're realizing that the patchwork that we've created of standards around the country just isn't performing. Now, how that can be done and who will actually do that is a big question mark, because even at the federal level, our system is very fragmented. And we don't have today, the White House has created a special group within the White House. We have FEMA. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Testing. They've gone off and developed certain kind of frameworks. We have the NIBS, is the National Institute of Building Science, that have developed their own. So we have all these little groups that are, doing things. We have research monies. HUD is doing a number of things, housing and urban development, but it's all fragmented and not well coordinated. My personal view is that if we really wanted to have a resilience national strategy, that belongs closer to somewhere like the Department of Commerce, which has under its wings NOAA, for example, Small Business Administration, and several other things that touch on resilience, than it does in an emergency firefighting organization like FEMA is. But Commerce has not really, developed in that direction. So it's a big question mark, and I think it's going to take some leadership at a very high level. And unfortunately, leadership comes when you have some big disasters, facing you. Then you decide to take action, as we've seen in past history. So that's pretty much what I can say within the short time of this discussion.
Yes, and I agree this is a topic that we could spend a whole webinar discussing, policy directions related to resilience, and maybe we will. But in case there are those out there, for example, at the state level, who decide we cannot wait for the federal government to act. And I'm thinking back to your slide that talks about moving away from simply an emergency preparedness mindset to something more proactive. And again, not necessarily limited to buildings, but if there were a couple of actions that a state level government could take without waiting for federal guidance to move into closer alignment with Sendai, what kinds of things might be at the top of your list?
Yeah, even states are fragmented. In fact, I'll stretch a little bit that direction you're headed in. I think our best chances for initiatives today are with city governments, because cities are really at the front line of all of this, in addition to many other issues. So you see cities essentially taking on this topic as an important one, and being supported by organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, which has donated to 100 cities around the world. A third are in the U.S., in fact. $1 million to each city to fund the position of a chief resilience officer and build a program around resilience. So cities, to me, are moving further and faster ahead than the states and federal governments, and probably will provide some role models that may be adopted in other areas.
Jess, would you like to ask a quick question for Aris before he finishes up his presentation?
Sure. Actually, I'll wait and hold this question until the end of the presentation.
Okay. Aris, please continue.
Okay. The next three topics are really much shorter, and a lot of them try to raise kind of questions and issues more than trying to analyze in depth, the full subject. So I see this as opportunities for further discussion under Collaboris or any other such forums here. One has to do with the relationship between resilience and the social issues, particularly social equity, because we have created a mindset that in order to make communities and housing being at the forefront of a community affordable, we have to keep standards low. And we say we do that to help the lower income classes. Now, the problem with that kind of mindset is that the lower income classes really do not have much diversification, so to speak of. Basically, their wealth, to the extent that it is their home and their possessions. And so by creating such a low standard for society, we expose the lower income classes to much more risk than we do any other group, proportionally. So I believe that leads to a vicious disaster poverty cycle where the standard is set so low, people in low-income classes really lose most of what they have, and it's all over, beginning again to rebuild their wealth. And if society really wanted to help the lower-income classes, the way to do it is to raise the bar, to raise the resilience bar, and look at how do we make this higher standard more affordable. Not how do we lower the standard to achieve affordability, but make it affordable so that these economic classes can really step up, can really build wealth over their lifetimes, instead of risking their wealth in what they basically have, their homes and possessions. So I challenge these social thinkers, let's say, in the community here that is discussing this, to really think of what this what this really means, because I often see situations where you go into public discussions, whether it's a hearing for higher standards, and you have the building community fighting for the lower standards, and I see then affordability groups, low-income groups, coming and say, yeah, we can't afford these standards, let's keep them low. And I think that mindset is driven by lack of awareness and insufficient education as to what this really means for these socially disadvantaged categories. So I leave this topic here at an open discussion level going forward. The next topic I'm going to spend a little bit more time on is the topic of insurance, because insurance is very often brought up when you talk about risk and hazards and so forth. And there's the mentality that insurance can solve our problem. whereas insurance is itself a lifeboat in need of resilience. So I'll talk a little bit in the next few slides about why that is so. And I'll start with a slide I've titled "The Truth About Insurance," is that insurance really follows, and I'm talking about private insurance here, not government-sponsored insurance, really follows the financial and disaster cycles, which really means that insurance is a spot market. Today you can get medium and long-term mortgage financing for a house. A lot of communities even give you some predictability on the taxes, limit the tax increases going forward from year to year. But when it comes to insurance, it's a price as you go business, so that next year's rate will be affected by whatever disasters happened this year and whatever the financial markets did during this period. And there's really no ability to give a consumer a 5-year insurance rate. And the reason for that is that the insurance companies have no idea what the 5-year insurance rate should be. They have no idea what that rate should really be. And the problem here that they face is that insurance works for residual risk, and I'll explain in the next slide what that means, and not structural risk. If you go back to the car example, the cars of the 60s had a lot of structural risk. In other words, they had weak doors, they didn't have the seat belts, they didn't have the inflatable bags, they didn't have the reinforced bumpers and so forth. Those all were solved structurally. And so what we ended up is insuring the residual risk in driving an automobile. And what we saw is that it created a very healthy and competitive automobile insurance market, one where the government didn't need to come in and take a role and subsidize and so forth, because the structural risk had been taken out. Therefore, structural risk requires structural solutions. And unfortunately, we also see in the insurance markets today that the government, the regulation the government imposes often distorts these markets, tries to underprice insurance, and what that causes is essentially these spikes and bumps when disasters happen in rates, and even carriers leaving states from time to time. So let's go and understand this, why we're exposed to structural risk. Basically, if you look at this as a diagram that shows the level of resilience, with higher being better, and incremental investment. In other words, 1.2 is 20% more investment in, let's say, an asset. 1.4 is a 40% more investment. So what you normally see when you look at the choices you have in building something is that there is a point where you get some diminishing return. In other words, the more you spend, the less benefit you get. And that's somewhere, at some point up there. In other words, it doesn't really incrementally pay to keep spending more money to reduce the risk or make the asset more resilient. So basically, below that, you have structural risk that you should do something and fix the asset, and above that is what's left, the residual risk, which should be insurable. But where we are today is down here. We're not building to a high enough level, so we essentially, with our escape hook codes, have a lot of structural risk that we're trying to solve through insurance. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. And that's what even the National Flood Insurance Program has discovered. That unless they solve the problem of people building in floodplains, of building too close to the waterfront and all these things, building too close to rivers, building too low, it's not insurable. They'll never be able to find a price. In other words, the price to insure it will be tremendous. We need to be somewhere up here with a resilience code that will really reduce the amount of structural risk and leave mainly the residual risk, which can be insured. So when you look at the business side of this, resilience is quite important to businesses, because in business you don't only have the asset at stake, your office or your warehouse or manufacturing facility, but also you have the interruption of your business and the effect it has on customers and them staying with you. You have the supply chain you have to worry about, impacts on the market, and then you have the dimensions of employees, what your employees affected, and your whole community that you're in. So really, for a business, the building itself is just the tip of the iceberg. And the losses a business faces could be 2 to 4 times just the building. Because below that you have all these other items that I mentioned before, including your reputation. An interesting study done by FEMA some years ago showed that post-disasters, and they were looking at major disasters, 40% of small businesses didn't reopen. And in fact, within a year, another 25% have failed. So almost 2/3 of small businesses are affected negatively by a disaster. And a lot of it triggered because their building and their community didn't survive. And you're only as resilient as the weakest link you have in the system. Another observation, and I read a few months ago that 30 million people essentially run a business out of their homes. And that number is probably going to double in the next 20 years. So a lot of our suppliers, our sources, our services, and so forth, essentially are dependent on that weak underbelly of the built environment. Running a business out of homes. Homes being the weakest link in the whole built environment. And finally, FEMA developed this 10 years ago when they looked at federal investment in resilience and came up with a figure of 4 to 1, that the benefit is 4 to 1. NIBS, the National Institute of Building Sciences, is being charged to do an update to that study and focus on business today. And I've talked to people in NIBS who are saying that for business, that benefit could be as large as 10 to 1. So a lot of the economic analysis that has been done historically has focused on the insurance industry and the government. What we need to do, and I turn here to the academic side of the discussion, is we need more research and more studies on the economics from the consumer's perspective and from the business person's perspective as to how they're impacted by hazards and by the lack of resilience. And this is just a graph. I just threw this in for the business case. Again, when you look at the 2 categories of losses, building and equipment, the portion in between is what insurance covers. The red portions are what the business covers itself. So even though you may have insurance, your costs, insurance is not going to save you if you're not resilient enough, or if your whole system is not resilient. And I've even advocated to some companies, look at your HR policies. A lot of companies spend money relocating people, especially their managers and professionals, from one area to another. Why not incentivize that relocation with policies that cause them to look at more resilient homes and communities? Because the last thing you want a key employee during a disaster is for him to be preoccupied with his home and his family. If that's safe, then he can dedicate some time and effort to looking after the business. So some are waking up that we need to take a 360 approach to resilience when we look at businesses. And finally, the final topic, which is the environmental side of resilience, which is becoming more and more apparent that disasters are a big environmental issue also. When you look at the resources of rebuilding the communities and cities and homes, the natural resources that go into that, when you look at the huge amounts of destruction debris that are collected and have to be landfilled, when you look at building on sensitive lands, all these have environmental issues. So I like to stress to the environmental community that one of the best avenues for addressing green issues is to improve resilience. And we have today numerous incentives in various communities for green investments and so forth. I like to advocate there that make resilience a prerequisite to those investments, because if those investments fail because of a hazard, you lose both the green side of the investment and the underlying asset itself. So as I mentioned in the original framework, this is the reason why I consider sustainability to be that area that overlaps between resilience and green, between a long-lasting functional asset and an asset that has a low environmental footprint and is energy efficient. and that climate adaptation is a form of resilience, whereas climate mitigation is a form of green. But the two really come together under the sustainability kind of region that overlaps there. And many of you have probably heard of the LEED designation for buildings under the U.S. Green Building Council, the U.S. GBC. I mean, LEED has been a great program over the last 15 years, starting from a very small beginning. But unfortunately, LEED is only focused on the green part of the equation, and they recognize that. And I like to tease a number of friends that I have in USGBC and say, you know, your facility may be platinum today, but if it becomes flat tomorrow, that's not sustainable. Or if you have to build it twice, it's not sustainable. Or if the green investment you added, the solar panels on the roof, is turned into debris because the structure itself was not strong enough, it's a double loss. So getting back to this image here, you know, I think this image kind of pulls together these ideas that we really need to focus on that sustainability area that brings all these dimensions closer together. So I'll just cover a couple things. I finished the fifth topic. I just want to touch on two slides from the addendum. One is this dimension of what can you do as a citizen and as a community member. And I won't go through all the exhibits. They're there for information purposes, but I'll just touch on the first two. And they really cover the area of taking responsibility, because you have to recognize that a lot of choices are made by default, by government, by some group that you never know or see about called the International Code Council or whatever. But in the end, you have a choice. I mean, you don't have to follow the minimum. You can go above the minimum, but you have to know you have a choice, and you have to know how to exercise that choice. And the most important area to exercise that choice is in your home. That's your most important decision. And then what you can do if you're in a home already, you know you're at risk, but you're stuck, and what you can do to support higher community standards. So I'll just talk about and close with this slide here, which is about taking responsibility, because I truly dislike the terminology natural disaster. I think it's so misleading because there's nothing natural about a disaster. There are hazards that are natural, and then there's development that we humans create that's not resilient, which leads to, I believe, the proper language we should be using is development disasters, the result of our own decisions and actions. So with that, Ira, I conclude this presentation from my side and turn back to you for questions or additional comments. And thank you again to the audience for being very patient in listening through this webinar.
Thank you, Aris. Great presentation. I'm going to let Jess pose her question to you while I change the presenter controls back to Deborah for her final segment. Jess?
Thanks, Ira, and thanks, Deborah and Aris. So, Aris, I want to point out how helpful it was in your presentation that you sort of looped back around to some of the earlier concepts. And near your introduction, you suggested that there's some really interesting opportunities for practitioners of resilience and sustainability, such as yourself, and faculty and institutions to engage and bring actionable strategies to the table. You talked about a very interesting model of resilience, the objects of resilience and how they're interrelated. And then from there, it occurred to me that when you talk about resilience and sustainability with various audiences and vulnerability and risk and the different ways in which sectors talk about these things, which you went into in a lot of good detail, whether you're talking with engineers or scholars or government officials, how they relate with the problem can vary. And I can see that you've learned a lot from this. My question is, how can educators and the institutions that support them take this learning and use it to work more effectively with sustainability and resilience practitioners to bring some of those strategies to life?
That's a good question, Jess. In fact, one of the things I can mention, I think you mentioned it in the introduction, since I retired a couple of years ago from my career of running a business. I've been involved in this area, written a book, but also have been helping Florida International University, their Extreme Events Institute, to create a graduate level certificate, which is they call it transdisciplinary program, because it can take graduate students from many different disciplines, from engineering, but also from journalism, from architecture, from earth sciences, and so forth, and create a minor program. And one of the things I have insisted in this kind of program is that it needs to be a combination of scholarly work, but also workshops which bring in people from the private sector and from cities and even nonprofits to look at real world problems. So I think universities can be ideal laboratories, I call it, for having such, extending a bit their programs and including such workshops where they bring in people from the outside to kind of, discuss real world problems and engage the students in providing solutions, developing solutions, but also thinking harder as to how they integrate their academic knowledge with solution-oriented approaches. So that's one of my suggestions. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an idea that I'm practicing myself, and I'm hoping it will produce fruit.
That's a great reply, and at the very least, a great starting point for some more questions. Thank you.
Deborah, why don't we move on to your final segment?
Okay, well, thank you. In sort of preparation and maybe response also to a couple of the questions, I also wanted to kind of reinforce that if we think back to the times, those of us who can think back to the times of Ralph Nader or what we've read about that time, or even the earlier stages of sustainability, if we go back to the evolution of where sustainability started and where it is today, we recognize that it gets a little bit chaotic. There's often a lot of players that jump in from a lot of different directions. Eventually this gets sorted out, and this is very much where we are right now with respect to what's happening with the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, Paris Agreement, Sendai, and so forth. We are at a point where there are many resources rushing together. And I think what becomes very important for educators and for all of us is to realize that there need to be these combining of efforts, combining of focus, combining of resources, and that is really where we're at right now. We're moving toward finding those common elements that we can then contribute to. So I really think we're on the cusp of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I really move into this topic of coherence as well. So in the last section, we are turning to how these frameworks interact, and students, whatever their disciplines, and again, if you think back to Eris's presentation, there isn't, again, one discipline or one set of organizations that will in fact be able to bring us all the solutions that are needed and also work on a number of these policies. They cover such a wide expanse of professions. So it becomes very important, I think, for students in particular to really understand how to bridge across these frameworks, as well as others that I'll talk about. We talked about NIBS and NIST and these other organizations. The work, resources, and commitment behind each agreement really can be leveraged and maximized, and there is nothing more powerful than when all actions and commitments align to drive change. And that's really what I think certainly the UNISDR, ARISE, and the work that we're doing is very much aimed at that. So with that, I do want to point out that in April of 2014, really in preparation for the upcoming agreements, the UNISDR recognized and published a coherence and mutual reinforcement paper. And we've included that on Collaborase as well. The Rio Plus 20 outcomes explicitly recognize the importance of strengthening coherence, coordination, and avoiding duplication of efforts. And this paper identified important opportunities, which included political recognition for coherence, the need to link monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and also to promote cooperation and implementation of past agreements. The role accepted by the UNISDR focused on that multi-stakeholder partnerships portion of the agreement and the commitments to capacity building. The topic of partnerships, as Ira and Eris alluded to earlier, warrants its own webinar, but suffice it to say that whether public, private, cross-industry, interfaith, intergovernmental, or interdisciplinary, models that make way for working, innovating, building, and benefiting together are essential to our surviving and thriving. For those of you who have attended the earlier dialogue sessions on the SDGs and climate change, you may recall the emphasis placed on collaboration, cooperation, and the need to combine our knowledge and resources in order to address our challenges. Partnerships at all levels cannot happen without shared goals, commitments, and desired outcomes. And this is an overarching theme across the frameworks, and the UNISDR and its partners are majorly responsible for driving this, what I'll call a mega goal. These next few slides are meant to illustrate the possible intersections and synergies that exist between and across our three frameworks, as well as where the opportunities to partner might actually lie. This graphic is actually from the U.S. General Administration Office, and I think it does a nice job of simplifying and connecting resilience, hazard mitigation, and climate change adaptation, and that's the graph primarily on the left. And I've layered the Sendai Framework's goal on the right to illustrate its relationship, which could actually be seen as an overarching one. From our earlier webinar on the SDGs, I really want to recall this integration model. Here, the SDGs are mapped against their contributions to water, whether too much or too little. But it can be used in a number of ways that will help reveal synergies between frameworks or between the SDGs and issues of materiality within a community, specific group, or business. This diagram has been composited from a UNISDR YouTube video that maps the Sendai Framework targets alongside the SDGs. We'll just take a second here to point out a few details. As you can see, targets 1 and 2 dealing with decreasing global mortality and the number of people affected, as well as target 6, increasing international cooperation, are seen as overarching all 17 SDGs. As further examples, Sendai Target 3, decreasing economic losses, are aligning with SDG 1, no poverty, and 8, decent work and economic growth. And Target 7 relates to SDG 13, climate change, and 11, sustainable cities and communities. I would also venture to say that it is also very relevant to SDG 3, good health and well-being. I think this will resonate after Eris's presentation as well. You know, if we think back to the 10 essentials, as well as the Resilient Cities Scorecard, and we take a look at this, we really can note the number of targets that align with SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. Eris had said this is kind of where our opportunities really perhaps are most concentrated. And I do believe that this intersection is one of the strongest and can be seen as a critical gateway for aligning and combining our goals, metrics, and our resources. This view maps the Sendai framework priorities alongside the SDGs. And what I tried to show here is really the relationship in terms of those that the Sendai framework have a leadership role to accomplish, those that the Sendai framework supports and strengthens, and those that they enable. In general terms, you'll see that there's again a fair amount of focus on good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, again innovation around infrastructure and sustainable cities, of course, and finally partnerships for the goals. So these are really where there is in fact a leadership opportunity to partner very strongly, and then in other cases to really strengthen these SDGs, and in other cases enable them. This is certainly not set in stone. This is really a straw model, and more dialogue around this I think would be extremely helpful, again, to determine how we should be aiming ourselves and allying in order to move our common objectives, or actually recognize, identify, and move our common objectives along. Moving on, it's especially good to see organizations working across the frameworks, and this is a good example of how NGOs are not only engaging and leveraging each other, but publicly recognizing the specific interconnections between their agendas. Inasmuch as the Global Compact rallies the private sector, this shows us how both public-private and public-public partnerships can work together to promote adaptation and resilience in support of SDG 13 and the Global Compact Principles 7, 8, and 9, which all fall under the environmental umbrella. Oops. I'm not sure what's happened, but it looks like I'm not in my presentation any longer. Oops. Ira, are you there?
Hi, Deborah. This is Jess. I'm just jumping in here. We can wait a couple more moments to make sure that Ira is able to connect and resolve the screen issue.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes, I'm on. I'm looking at the slideshow on your screen, Deborah.
Right. It's somehow hang on a second. It feels as if though I'm in a different presentation here. So let me just get back on. Okay. I think I'm back on schedule here. So all right. So let me just hit this one. There is another agreement that we might want to begin to dial in and into our conversations, and that is Addis Ababa. And this is dealing with gaining traction in funding sustainable development. I'm giving this just a quick reference and include it as a placekeeper for us to potentially revisit during our continued dialogue. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap things up. And so as doing so, let me bring back this graphic and stress something that you've likely recognized as a major theme in this presentation, and that is, and again, we discussed this earlier, that is the whole concept of collaboration and partnerships. And so, it takes, it takes a lot to be dealing with our complex issues. It takes more cooperation and less competition. It takes systems thinking and understanding, the sharing and transfer of knowledge, and innovation at almost every level in every discipline. And not to lay this work at the feet of any one player in particular, but I do believe that it is education that can move us toward progress and success faster, really, than any other. So with that, let me thank you, and thank you for your interest and your attention, and invite you to reach out to either Aris or me, and we certainly look forward to working with you on Collaborase. Many thanks.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Aris. You've presented a wealth of information today, not only on the Sendai framework, but also how concepts and principles of resilience are applied. Let me ask Jess if there are any burning questions remaining in the queue, because we can take one or two quick questions. If not, I'll proceed to wrap up.
I think I'm going to take the questions that I've got and write them down and add them into the queue of the or the discussion on our online dialogue.
Very good, and that's a nice segue to reminding all of our listeners that you have received an invitation to opt into our Collaborase platform. Please do so. If you can't find that email invitation, contact us and we'll send you a new invitation. You'll need to access Collaborase to participate in the follow-on Q&A and the co-creation of the synthesis document for the full 2030 Development Agenda dialogue, meaning the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and today's topic, the Sendai framework. With that, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online on Collaborase, and please continue to check the SCC website and our monthly update for our upcoming activities. Thanks to all.